Hello, everybody, and happy Easter. This is Dirk Wooster, and I had a special Easter message I wanted to share with you this year, which I'm going to call Reality Religion. And I'd like to start out with addressing an assumption that many in our society today have, and that is all religions are equal. Now, this statement, you might say, has two levels of understanding to it. One which is incorrect, and one which does hold some merit. First, let's address the incorrect part of the statement that some believe, and that's all religions are the same. Any cursory review of the tenets of the major religions in the world will make one quickly aware that they are indeed not the same. Just a simple study will give you an understanding that their main tenets of what makes up God, how you interact with God, and what life values one should follow under their practice are drastically different and sometimes even conflicting. For example, some think God made everything, while others believe there is no creator at all. Clearly different and not the same. But there is also an underlying tenet of this statement that is a more plausible question that many in our society have. Are all religions equal? This addresses a different view, more of a preferential view, a type of saying one likes chocolate ice cream and another likes vanilla. Both are ice cream. The choice is just a merely preference of the flavor one prefers. What is best to your liking? And for the majority of religions in the world, I believe you can say this statement actually does have some merit. For example, Buddha teaches philosophies he got from enlightenment he says came to him. Islam is based on the understanding Muhammad got from hearing a voice in a cave that allowed him to write a Quran. Hinduism is based on stories from religious history passed down, and many other religions are like this as well. So you might say in part it comes down to what preference of the religious philosophy views that have been developed by a religious leader matches closest with your view of life, or in a lot of cases, how were you taught growing up on that view of life? A bit of type of preference, you might say, to how you want to believe the world to be true in your own eyes. But there is one distinct religious group that has an entire different basis on what they stake their belief system upon. That's Christianity. And they make a claim that any religious leader or group would be considered insane to make for the basis of starting a religion. That claim, well, it's probably most concisely stated in the biblical book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 15, verses 12 through 14. And it states this: "But if it is preached that Christ has been raised from the dead, how can some of you say there is no resurrection of the dead? And if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith." You see, other religions claim they saw God while meditating under a tree or in a cave or getting special tablets or hearing stories of godly legends, all which are certainly claims that could be made, yet they're not claims that can be systematically substantiated by worldly evidence. Well, you may prove it that one sat under a tree or went into a cave. It's impossible to prove the voice they heard or thought they heard, and whether they did or not, it's up to another's opinion to believe that. You can't physically test those claims, and you have a preference of believing those claims or not. But as I stated earlier, Christianity makes an entirely different basis claim. An audacious claim. A plain crazy claim any religious leader or religious group would want to start a religion upon if that's what they wanted to do. Unless, of course, it's true. To state it distinctly in our language today, if Jesus Christ did not physically come back from being totally dead for an extended period of time and then came alive again, then Christianity is just plain, flat out stupid. And anyone who practices it is stupid as well. The Christian belief puts forth the basis of their belief with something that can be validly tested in the real world. We can prove if a dead man's dead, can't we? Coroners do it every day. Police do it when a body is moved or hidden. You can track down the evidence of a dead body that was buried or stolen, or even, as the Christians unbelievably claim, risen and not there anymore. That is a real life event that can use real life forensic evidence to verify the claim made. It is not a philosophical statement. It is stated as a real concrete event that they proclaimed took place in history. Yet this event, as you know, didn't happen last week. It's almost 2,000 years now ago it happened. So is there any possible way we can hold this trial with some evidence today, similar to the evidence that could be used in our court system of today, as the way it was initially claimed? Can we prove through scientific forensic investigation the claim made is true beyond a reasonable doubt that the supernatural occurred, that Jesus Christ rose from the dead? I know it might sound like an oxymoron with science proving the supernatural it can't explain, but today, while I'm not a lawyer in the real world, I'm going to take up the defense attorney role of this case, addressing the significant courtroom evidence that I believe provides credence to just such a claim. So let's begin with some of the strongest evidence in any case. That's eyewitness testimony. While those first witnesses that saw the resurrected Jesus obviously aren't able to physically appear before us today to make their defense, we do have historical writings of these men that were meticulously, accurately maintained in detail to what they indeed did claim regarding their statement. So to be fair, we first need to consider the eyewitness testimony of Jesus' 12 apostles and the veracity of the claim they made. Each claiming to have seen the resurrected Christ and stood up in opposition to the Jewish religious leaders of that day that claimed the body was stolen. So let's consider first which testimony is more worthy of consideration. And in that, I'd like to offer my first point of defense of consideration of these men's testimony, that it is not only with their words they testified, but with their very lives. So let's look at the testimony those lives showed by the ending they came about. First, we have one of Jesus' disciples that's probably the most famous known, and that's Judas, who betrayed him. And he hung himself in remorse for what he had done. And that hanging occurred even before Jesus died. So his death does not prove anything regarding the resurrection, just that he felt he had betrayed an innocent man. But what about his other followers? Here's a historical document of the tradition of understanding how their lives ended for taking the stand on that audacious claim. Listen to this list. You had the Apostle James, who was believed to be headed by Herod Agrippa in 44 AD. You had Bartholomew, who evangelized Turkey, Iran, India, Ethiopia, Persia, and Egypt, and then was believed to be skinned alive and beheaded in Armenia in 68 AD. You had Thomas, the one we call the doubter, but he testified to the end, and he was stabbed to death with a spear in India for converting wife and son of an Indian king. You have Matthew, who was killed by the sword at the order of the king of Ethiopia. You have Philip, who was crucified by being bound to a tall cross in Figura. You have Andrew, who was crucified at Patras in Achaia in 60 AD. You have the other James, the son of Alphaeus, who preached in many cities, returned to Jerusalem, where he was stoned to death. You have Judas Thaddeus, who evangelized in Syria, northern Persia, and Armenia, and he was killed by a lance in Armenia or by a halberd in Persia. You have Simon the Zealot, who was evangelized in Britain, Egypt, North Africa, Spain, and Persia, who was martyred alongside Judas Thaddeus, they said, by being sawn asunder in Persia. You have Simon Peter, who was crucified upside down in Rome. And you have John, the one apostle that died of natural causes, but not because they didn't try to kill him, as he was boiled in oil in Rome in 95 AD, that tradition tells us turned into an invigorated bath for him. And then he was sent to Ephesus in exile, only apostle who died a natural death. And who I don't have on this list is the apostle Paul, later on, who we know was also killed in Rome for the same testimony. Note this list. All died a martyr's death, except Judas, who betrayed him and killed himself ahead of time, and the apostle John, who tradition tells us they tried to kill, but they couldn't. Why were they killed? Every one of them died for the testimony that they believed this Jesus Christ, who they claimed to be the Son of God, came back to life to prove it. These men, who we are told in the Bible hid cowardly when he was crucified, now come out and proclaim Christ with such force and passion to the point of accepting a very bitter end to their lives. Now, a lot of people will die for sincere beliefs they have. It's true. We see it with the suicide bombers of today, dying for the truth they hold to be true. We also see it with many other Christian martyrs that died after the time of the apostles for their sincere belief as well. But all of these apostles died because they say they had seen Jesus bodily raised from the dead. Not something they believed through what they had been taught, but something they believed because they actually saw it. Now, as we said, many died for sincere things they believe. But how many people do you know that would die for a lie they know is a lie? In fact, what you see is that any time you do see a lie in a situation coming up between people and they start getting persecuted, they immediately start turning on one another or they change their story. Yet you do not see this in one case with the apostles. They all died and went to their deathbed, testifying on what they saw. They literally gave their lives so the truth they witnessed might be shown valid in the miracles God worked through them and the truth they proclaimed. So I ask you, if they did hide the body, why weren't the religious leaders able to track down that body? As we said earlier, if you torture one, we always see in turn somebody will turn over the known lie to save themselves. But none did. And others claim the apostles were just simply starting a religion based on other pagan beliefs at the time. Then they had influenced a large majority of the Roman Empire because of the slavery that was there to their falling. I ask you again, what power did any of these guys have to do that? They were not the political movers and shakers in Israel, let alone in the Roman Empire. They were all simple men. What possibly type of man-made power could they generate, or did they have? And if they were said to influence others for their benefit, consider what they got for such powerful influence. All but John died a death of torture. Why would they do what they did, die like they did, for a lie that had nothing but a reward of cruel death at the end? Doesn't make sense. Well, others say they might have hallucinated in a dream. I've had some pretty vivid dreams in the past, but my whole household has not had the same dream. And also, even though my dreams were vivid, I would think long and hard before dying for a dream I had while I slept or was chemically induced possibly. Yet all of them were so convinced in what they saw, they died for it. Again, I think when one considers such lives, one can only conclude that they were thoroughly convinced Jesus Christ had bodily risen from the dead, and convinced by the fact they had seen him. Historic and forensic evaluation is yet to prove any reasonable evidence to contradict their claims on that point. There is no dead body anywhere, any place of Jesus Christ to be found. Well, that's the testimony we have from them. But is there any other type of evidence we might look at to see if there is any truth that this Jesus is really the God he claimed to be, as proven by his resurrection? Is there any details we can look at regarding major events around the claim of Jesus' death on the cross and subsequent resurrection, and see what other forensic evidence we might have available to us to look that could indicate something to further validate these eyewitnesses' claims? Well, first let's take a look at the day of the cross. Yes, you did hear me right a moment ago. I said the day of the cross. And I did not mean that figuratively, I meant that literally. I submit to you, in agreement with Frederick A. Larson's research from his in-depth video study for the Star of Bethlehem, that Jesus Christ was crucified on April 3rd, 33 AD. Now, before you tell me I'm going crazy, saying I'm actually identifying the day, first hear the evidence for that date is laid out masterfully by Mr. Larson, who, by the way, is a professional attorney. So what proof do we have of that day? Well, we know from historical records that Jesus was born during the time of King Herod, which, depending on when you believe Herod died, from the various different views of the chronographers, you would put Jesus' birth anywhere from 7 BC to 1 BC, based on Josephus' writings. We know from biblical and other historical records that Tiberius was Caesar, reigning at Rome during this time, and that Pontius Pilate reigned from 26 to 36 AD, the one who Jesus was tried before. We also know from Scripture that Jesus did not start his ministry until he was 30 years of age, Luke 3:23. We know from the book of John that Jesus experienced at least 3 Passovers during his time of ministry celebration, John 2:23, 6:4, and 13:1. But perhaps the greatest clue is that we know from Scripture, all 4 Gospels in fact, that Jesus was crucified the day before Passover on Friday. Matthew 27:62, Mark 15:42, Luke 23:54, and John 19:14. Well, why is this such a crucial clue? Because we know that Passover begins the 14th day of the Jewish lunar month of Nisan in the spring. By Judean tradition, the Passover begins at twilight between the 14th and the 15th. Now, when you have a birthday, You know your birthday always occurs on the same date every year, but it does not necessarily occur on the same day. In fact, quite often it occurs on different days. Well, putting our clues all together, of all this information we have, we know Jesus had to be crucified during Pilate's reign on a day when Nisan 14th falls on a Friday, which we can trace back. And it leaves us two dates, April 7th, 30 AD, and April 3rd, 33 AD. The April 3rd, 33 AD seems to be the most likely for several reasons. First deals with a little political intrigue with Pontius Pilate, appeasing the Jews when he released Barabbas at Jesus' trial. History tells us Pilate had anti-Jewish ways and went against them many times over the Jews when he first came to Judea. But he was also allied with Sejanus, a Roman senator who was trying to usurp Tiberius Caesar's throne. But he had a little problem, Pilate did. Tiberius caught Sejanus, and he killed him in 31 AD. Well, why does that matter? Because after that time, Pilate couldn't afford any uprising, as Tiberius didn't trust him as he was a close ally with Sejanus. So he had to walk a pretty tight line. The second we have is the scriptural based, which is really quite incredible. And that's in Daniel 9, verses 25 and 26, with an incredible prophecy that Daniel talks about Jerusalem being rebuilt and the time up until the anointed one would cut off, giving days that would happen. If you calculate the dates from the time King Xerxes of Persia gave the command to rebuild the city with the years described, you come to a date right at this very time period. I will let you go into that further research, which is amazing in itself. But yet, did anything special happen on that day? We might ask. Well, first let me take you to a part of Peter's Pentecost sermon from the book of Acts, chapter 2, verses 19 to 22, where Peter states a prophecy out of the book of Joel. I will show wonders in the heavens above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. So men of Israel, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourself know. Notice how he concluded this point of his sermon. He said, as you yourself know. He said, you saw these things. You saw the sun turn dark and the moon go bloody. You've seen it. You know. So what really happened on that day of April 3rd back in 33 AD? Well, first it says the sky went dark. We know there was no solar eclipse that day. Thus we can't confirm the sun turned dark with that evidence from our astronomy models, but we do have some literary evidence beyond the Bible. A non-biblical source written from Phlegon Trillenius in his writings entitled Olympiad says in the time period, which he had dated the 202nd Olympiad, which goes back to 33 AD range, a failure of the sun took place greater than any previously known, and the night came on at the 6th hour of the day, noon. So that stars actually appeared in the sky, and a great earthquake took place in Bithynia and overthrew the greater part of Nicaea. Go read the biblical scripture of the day of the cross, and you'll find that this matches very closely with a dark cloud and an earthquake to follow. And by the way, Phlegon's description is a pagan writer, but yet it tracks the Bible's explanation on the events of the cross. But what about the moon turned blood? On April 3rd, 33 AD, I can tell you with 100% mathematical confidence, it did. The moon turned to blood. And this is a picture of a blood moon. You might have heard of it before, but just what exactly is a blood moon? In our modern language, we call it a lunar eclipse. Why bloody? Because when the moon is in eclipse, it is in the Earth's shadow and it receives no direct light from the sun, but is lit only by the dim light refracted and redshifted by the Earth atmosphere. The moon in eclipse goes to a glow red as if covered by blood. How do we know it was a blood moon when it came up that evening? By the same computer models that NASA tracks their movement of the planets to fire their rockets. The universe moves in mathematical pattern and precision. Scientists that first noted this was Kepler, and later modifications were made by Newton in the mathematics, and today that mathematics has been put in the invention of the modern computer. Now with just the purchase of astronomy software, anybody can look back in time and see exactly what the sky looked like on a given night in history. On April 3rd, 33 AD, a bloody moon rose that night. And I again will refer you to Mr. Larson's Star of Bethlehem video that goes into this in so much greater detail, both with the astronomy software and showing views from both the Earth and from the moon. And I believe you will find it, like I did, to be quite shocking as what the results show. So circumstantial evidence that we have shows the event of the crucifixion of the cross had some pretty amazing things happen. I would even say it illustrates the death of Jesus, implied the death's point that the apostles claimed that Jesus was no ordinary man. Yet this does not prove the resurrection claim. It only helps us confirm that this death at this time actually happened as predicted. And the required evidence needed before you can have the resurrection, you had to have the death. This shows that. But what about proof of the resurrection? Do we have any proof there? Do we have any further evidence? What we might say in the modern courtroom terms, do we have some DNA from the crime scene? Well, Scripture tells us in John 20, verses 4 through 8, the following about some of those first witnesses at the empty tomb. It says, both were running, that's John and Peter, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but he didn't go in. Then Simon Peter, who was behind him, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside, and he saw and believed. So what scientific claim can be made about these statements? I'm going to submit to you with strong scientific evidence to follow that we have these very linens talked about this in this verse. When put under the scientific microscope of test, which they have been, they show something supernatural. So supernatural that even the scientists who studied it in depth flat out say they can't explain it. So let's look at what this evidence presents. This is the picture of the linen I'm talking about. It's called the Shroud of Turin, named after the town it is currently kept in Turin, Italy. It is an artifact that has been claimed by the Catholic Church to be the authentic burial cloth of Jesus that has been passed down through history. Now, many relics have proven to be false forgeries, and many false linens as well have been made claiming to be Christ's grave clothes. But even scientists who have studied it said that it is either the greatest forgery ever made, or it's a representation of a supernatural event they couldn't explain that caused the image on the cloth. They have no idea how the image could have gotten there. And the only scientific claim that has come against its authenticity is a carbon dating test they did back when they first looked at the shroud, this team, in the late 1970s. And that test came back indicating readings of one of the threads they took of the origination of being in the Middle Ages. But there are numerous scientific reasons and other reasons why these tests have a very high probability of being wrong on that one instance. I will discuss those briefly in a moment, but let's first talk about the shroud itself. It has two distinct types of marking. The first and most obvious to you is the bright marks you see around the middle of the cloth, which were not on the original cloth, but caused by a fire that occurred around the 13th century, and subsequently was patched up and sewed underneath by the outer edges. The second image in the very middle of the cloth causes incredible intrigue of what makes this cloth so special, and that's the image of an anatomically correct man that illustrates bloodstains and marking matching the description of crucifixion that the Bible points to. But before I get into more details of the shroud itself, let me go back first. Since I am a defense attorney, I have to address the carbon dating. Now, the initial team, they call them the STURP team, the Shroud of Turin research team, went in 78, and they came back with their conclusions in 1981, which we will discuss here over the next few slides. But one of the conclusions they came back again states that the cloth itself, from the carbon testing, dated back to the Middle European timeframes. And the shroud does have records showing it first appearing around 1350 in Europe. Before that time, it's uncertain how it got there, and that is why some immediately claim forgery with the carbon dating and not having sufficient documentation all the way back before that time period. But there are some very solid evidence to show why that dating might be wrong, and proof that the shroud was in existence previous to this. So let's go a little through that. First, why the dating of the carbon might appear wrong. They took the dating from a thread on the side of the linen. That is where they sew a backing on the cloth underneath that helps support it. While the scientific team took this backing off, when they tested it, it could have indeed been a sewing particle of that not on the original cloth, which indeed, when looked at under a microscope and actually claimed by someone who tested it, that the fibers did appear different than the other cloth. Second, and even more significant, is that they found a type of bacteria that is an old item, that happens on old items, like this cloth, that are shown to definitely skew the testing for sure. Third, if the event that some scientists believe could have possibly caused this image with a great burst of radiation power, it too would have influenced the dating and skewed it. But there is far more evidence to an earlier date as well. So let's turn to that. Did you ever wonder how the artist ever came up with the image Jesus looked like? In all Jesus pictures, there are always some general classifications that allow you to determine that the picture is Jesus. One painter in particular of Jesus, found in a Greek Orthodox monastery known as the Planogrator, shows these general characteristics of Jesus we know that was painted in the 6th century or earlier. And it ties identically to the images of the face on the shroud. We also know that images before this time and pictures of Jesus showed him in a totally different way, more as a young boy without a beard. But why so late in this change? Well, there is a historical story of a king in Edessa who was ill and called for Jesus, but he had already been killed. So instead, they brought him the cloth, the burial linens he was buried in, and it said the man was healed. It was said it could be seen hanging in the palace of the palace of that king, the image of this man, and was known as the Mendilion, or little cloth. But why only the face? We see a full outstretch here of a whole body, but why just the face? Well, it's probably because a king would not want to have grave clothes hanging in full view. And indeed, the cloth does show folds embedded in the shroud in such a way that when folded in that manner, leave only the image of the face showing. The Mendilion, as it's called, was then believed to be moved to Constantinople in 944 AD as the Muslim conquests were encroaching. But then we also know it became missing around 1204, about the time of the Fourth Crusade, when the Crusaders were known to ransack the city and taken off many items. It is then at that time when the Mendilion goes missing for some 100+ years until it finally shows up in Europe. Well, is this just a far-fetched story trying to link the two together somehow? Well, there is more, and these aspects come in scientific testing of the cloth. When tested, the cloth itself was shown to have a consistent weave with those made on looms in the Middle East during the time period Jesus was on this earth. The cloth was also found to have a mineral substance on it, which was deemed to be limestone, a kind that is indigenous to the area around Jerusalem and would certainly seem to be in a grave he might have been placed on. The cloth was found to have pollen particles on it that are only found in plants in the Jerusalem area. By the way, did you know pollen particles lasted that long? Maybe that's why allergies are so bad, huh? But the cloth further had some other items on it too, with blood patterns of the cloth that were tied to another relic called the Sindorian, which was believed to be the folded face cloth in the story and is held in Spain. And they're found to have identical blood stains on that cloth as the shroud, and actually matched in AB blood type between the two. And the Sindorian has official records taking it back all the way to the 7th century. All this information allows us to come to several conclusions. This cloth was in the Jerusalem area at some time during its life, not just the European area. It has links to other artwork and artifacts, and even some other literary comments that illustrate an existence before the 13th century. And there are also very valid scientific reasons why the carbon dating appears to be incorrect. But now that we covered the history, let's talk briefly what the scientists did find when they researched the item and tried to determine what their mission of this test was, what actually made the image. Again, the Dirk group of scientists, some even coming from NASA, went in during the late 1970s with a main goal to determine how was this image formed. They weren't going in to determine, is this the burial cloth of Christ, but how did the image get there? And they spent thousands of hours of different types of scientific methods of studying, checking, and they came back with this conclusion. They know many things it is not, but they could not tell scientifically how the image was made. They had some assumptions that a bright burst of power somehow created the image, but they knew no way, even today at that time, how such power could be created that would do this. Quite simply, it was beyond scientific explanation. And some of their specific findings they did note, they found bloodstains confirmed on the cloth, and they found those bloodstains were soaked into the cloth, not just imaged and splattered on it. They also found that it was not made by any type of paint, dyes, or body type of secretions that created the image. They checked to see if it might have been scorched in using UV technology and found the burns showed creating the image through the cloth was not through burning. They noted color changes in the thread was due to some chemical change to create the image. And the change was such that in some cases, it only changed parts of a thread to the size of 1/10 the diameter of the human hair. There is no way known today even how to replicate those marks in such detail. Still, while these points are interesting, how can we relate this to possibly being the burial cloth of Jesus Christ and not just anybody else? In a large part, it's what you see when you take a photography picture of the shroud. And here's where it gets fascinating. Oh, before I first go to the photography picture of the slide, let me give you a modern day rendering of the man under the shroud that was presented in the 2010 History Channel documentary called The Face of Jesus. This documentary shows an extensive effort by a group of scientists who took on the task with modern technology and computer graphics to digitally extract a reasonable likeness of the man on the Shroud of Turin from the image imprinted on the cloth. Granted, this wasn't an easy task and couldn't have been done in the 70s. But with our technology today, they were able to create the image the shroud presented, overcoming a number of serious obstacles to do so. Paramount among them were extensive blood stains, masking the face and the image difficult to discern, imprinted on the woven cloth, the lights and darks reversed. But they did it. And this is the image they came up with as a reasonable likeness. Does this image look like any pictures of Jesus you might have seen before? As I stated earlier, did you ever wonder how the artist came up with Jesus' face? Computer digital imaging of the shroud today gives verification to the past painter's picture of the image they were working on from the shroud. Again, going back to the photography and the amazing thing it shows. When you take a picture of the shroud, you would expect a picture like a normal blanket of anything you take. But instead, the picture came back a negative, like an X-ray. And while the picture you see on this slide is okay, with on the left showing the frontal view and on the right showing the back of the slide, I can tell you from seeing one that's blown up 6 feet, you can see all the indications of the wounds with incredible details. In fact, on one video I saw on the shroud, they had a pathologist examine a blow-by-blow picture. I am based on what I'm showing you here, and tell the aspects of the individual injuries to the individual. But here are some of those findings, but let me talk a little bit about the shroud first and the coloring you're seeing. if you focus again on the picture of the man in the middle, and on this negative, if you see those bright white lines right on the hands, up around the head, on the side, you see the marks on the back. Those are all from blood stains that would have been on the cloth that appeared accordingly. As you can see, we know this is a crucified man by the marks on the wrist. And what's unique about this individual is they were whipped incredibly, as we can see on their back, from their calves all the way up to the top of their shoulders. And also this individual had something that caused a great amount of blood around his head. And we see a wound in their side as well on the upper left, where something would have caused a puncture wound there that caused the draining. But let me give you specifically what the coroner found as he looked at this. We mentioned that there's a piercing through the feet area with one foot draped over another. And again, these are clearly the marks of an individual who had been crucified. But there's more to indicate it wasn't just any typical crucifixion. As I've already said, there were puncture wounds in the head caused by tiny pointed objects, like a crown of thorns. In the side was a piercing with an upward thrust headed toward the heart, and the individuals have compared it to the Roman spears that this picture utilized at the time of Christ's proposed death, and it matches those artifacts we have from that time period exactly. But possibly the most conclusive is that from the back and the back legs we can see this individual was unmercifully whipped. The markings match identical to that of a Roman whip called the flagellum that had balls of steel and bone that would cause markings and then the skin to rip off. And these markings go all the way up the legs across the back. This was definitely not the norm of any crucifixion, as the idea was make them to suffer on the cross. But as we know from the biblical account of Jesus, the markings we see are exactly what it tells happened to them. Other interesting items the coroner pointed out is that one of the knees was damaged, and the nose appeared like it might have been broken, like they had fallen and went to the face into the ground as they walked sometime during their trip. Additionally, bruises are noted on their shoulder, like the individual was carrying some heavy instrument. Again, Jesus walked carrying his cross, and biblical events tell us he stumbled and fell and needed help as he went to the ground. Everything about the entire image ties identical to the gospel accounts. Also, I'd seen where one scientist actually took this image and created a holographic image from it based on the picture, which provided more details of the individual 3D view. And when they did that, they actually found coins placed on the eyes, which was a common custom of that day, and the coins themselves showed the image of Tiberius, dating it back to that day. Another tie back to the time frame, and evidence that it's highly probable that this is a picture of the linen Jesus was buried in. But there's another interesting test they did as well. They took a picture of the shroud, and they took it and used what NASA calls a DP8 image analyzer that's used on space mission to analyze terrain, and they applied it to the picture of the shroud. Now, when this is used on a normal photography taken of individuals, the individual simply comes back in a blurred looking picture of the results of the digital analyzer. But in this case, the shroud picture itself presents a type of 3D image shown above as a sheet draped around a body form. This is true of both of the front and the back image, that somehow something was causing this image to go up that shows on the analyzer right through the cloth. And the scientists have no idea of how this happened other than it appeared to have occurred through an intense power burst. But yet, that power burst did not burn the cloth itself, other than leave the image. Thus taking us back to the conclusion the scientists came with after all their study. They have no earthly idea how this image got on this cloth. But could it give us a picture of God leaving the picture of the resurrection? Well, I'd like to bring my case to a close with a few final remarks. One of the scientists interviewed commented that one night after reviewing the shroud, he knew he would probably get questions regarding the emotional impact the review had on him. And he wanted to sit down for a moment and assess this side of the equation. So he took the picture of the face on the shroud, and he commented as he looked at it that no great lightning bolts hit him, nor did he have any specific waves of emotion. But one thing just seemed to grip him and reach out to him, of how peaceful this picture of the man on the shroud appeared, despite the beating that is illustrated on the rest of his body. It just seemed in such contrast. Well, we all need to take a look at this picture. And I think clearly, if you agree with nothing else on this presentation, you can see Christianity is not like any other religion. There is no other religion you could even attempt to make the courtroom presentation I made today about the claims of truth of their belief. It is entirely different. Christianity has factual evidence we can go back to. Is that claim true? You know, regardless of what evidence you look at in any trial, it still takes your own faith and the proof of the evidence presented to come to your personal conclusion. Right or wrong, the verdict of the case. In the case of Christianity, though, it can firmly be stated it's not just a belief on what somebody said. It is not, as someone claims, a blind faith of leap into the dark, but rather it's a faith that is based on logic, discernible evidence that brings us into the light, which I believe is the greatest truth of all history. I personally believe the evidence I have presented to you today is worthy of such honest consideration. I also add my voice to those of the witnesses regarding my own greatest personal evidence for me being the supernatural peace and purpose that is brought in my heart from the risen Savior Jesus Christ, my Lord and my God. I have that peace for the severe cruelty he took for me. That is evidence I absolutely know to be true for me. It may not work for you, but that truth can be yours as well if you pray to the risen Christ to be your Lord and Savior as well. There's never a better time to do that than this moment. He's worthy of our life's allegiance. Yet regardless of your deliberation, I hope as you continue to assess the evidence for your own verdict that it may become true for your life as well, that you may truly know the Prince of Peace and find such peace as well as is in his face. And I'd like to end today's message with a video today from YouTube and a presentation in images of the great song by Don Francisco describing this event called He's Alive. Happy Easter.